At least the army pays her rent. That was my father's voice, polished and practiced, echoing across a ballroom filled with marble floors and champagne laughter. The sentence floated through the air like a line he had rehearsed 100 times, meant to draw polite laughter from people who measured worth in wine labels and last names. I stood at the doorway, the sound slicing clean through me before I even took a step. The chandeliers sparkled above a crowd of senators, bankers, and donors who moved like they were part of one expensive machine. Every head turned toward my father, Richard Blake, real estate mogul, philanthropist, and master of public charm. He was in his element, the center of every conversation, his smile smooth and unbothered. He had no idea I was there. Not yet. When the general beside me announced my name, the room stilled. The sound of violins faltered mid-note. I walked forward, heels striking the marble in a rhythm that felt more like a heartbeat than footsteps. The weight of the uniform settled on my shoulders, the ribbons and silver stars glinting under the chandelier's light. A silence spread across the room, sharp and heavy. My father turned, his smile frozen halfway between pride and disbelief. The glass in his hand tilted, red wine blooming across his cuff. I stopped a few feet away, spine straight, gaze steady. I didn't need to speak. My presence said everything I had waited years to tell. My name is Jessica Blake. I'm a Major General in the United States Army. And the man who just mocked me in front of a room full of strangers is the same man who once told me service was for people who failed at life. That night, I wasn't there for revenge. I was there to exist, visible and undeniable, in the one world he thought I'd never belong to. I grew up in a 5-bedroom colonial in Arlington, Virginia, where silence filled more space than furniture ever could. My father liked things perfect: polished shoes by the door, dinner on white linen, and children who smiled but never spoke out of turn. He built his fortune on flipping buildings, turning old into new, then new into gold. Status wasn't just something he chased, it was oxygen. Every friend had a title, every event a photographer, every decision a calculation. In our house, the military wasn't respected, it was pitied. My father called soldiers grunts with no other options, men who couldn't make it in college or the boardroom. That belief sat like stone at every dinner, making it clear which paths were acceptable and which were not. When I told him I wanted to attend West Point, I did it during dinner, in front of my mother and his colleague from the club. I was 17 and certain. I had practiced my delivery in the mirror, steady and calm, but the silence after I spoke was so thick it felt like a slap. He set down his fork and asked if I was joking. Then he looked at my mother, like she was to blame. Like she had raised a daughter who didn't understand what it meant to carry the Blake name. His voice was calm, but cold enough to make my stomach turn. He told me I was wasting my life chasing uniforms and war, that no daughter of his would join the ranks of failures. My mother reached for my hand under the table. Her fingers trembled against mine, but she didn't speak. She never did when he was in that mood. That night, I packed a single duffel bag and left. No money, no promises. I slept on a friend's couch for 3 weeks and took a job waiting tables at a diner that didn't care what my last name was. I picked up a second job cleaning offices at night. Every hour I worked got me closer to the physical prep requirements for West Point. I trained in the mornings, studied in the afternoons, and collapsed into bed long after midnight. There were days I hated him, not just for the rejection, but for the way he made me believe I had something to prove. I didn't want to succeed just to escape him. I wanted to succeed so his version of me would vanish entirely. The first time I saw the acceptance letter, I didn't smile. I just sat still, holding the paper like it was both a weapon and a shield. That letter wasn't just an entry to West Point. It was the first brick in a life I was building on my own, without him, without anyone. Basic training at Fort Jackson didn't break me on day 1. It waited until day 4. That's when my knees gave out halfway through a 10-mile march, and a drill sergeant screamed in my face while I tried to blink sweat out of my eyes. My whole body ached. My blisters had blisters. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight, and couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken to me like a human being. Nights were worse. That was when the doubt crept in. I cried the first night, quietly, under the covers, biting down on the edge of my blanket so no one would hear. I wasn't crying from pain. I was crying from shame. The voice in my head sounded like my father, telling me I didn't belong here either. Lauren showed up in week 2. She was tall, fast, and never seemed tired. We ended up assigned to the same bunk, and she had a way of making brutal mornings feel almost manageable. She didn't ask about my past, just handed me her extra protein bar one night and said we'd both live to see graduation. When we ran in formation, I focused on her footsteps. When my arms shook during push-ups, I stared at the dirt and pretended it was hardwood back in Virginia. Everything that used to define me, last name, bank account, zip code, none of it mattered in a uniform. There was something oddly beautiful about that. I didn't have to explain who I was or where I came from. No one cared if my dad owned buildings in D.C. or if I used to wear heels to brunch. I was nobody's daughter in that uniform. And that's when I finally felt free. The pain didn't stop, but it became familiar, almost welcome. I learned to push past the burn, to keep my mouth shut and my head high. Every small win felt massive passing rifle quals. Getting my boots right, earning my first salute. Lauren once told me, the Army doesn't care who you were, only who you are under pressure. I didn't realize it then, but she was teaching me how to become someone entirely new. Someone built, not inherited. Someone who didn't need permission to belong. Kandahar was dry and endless. Dust crept into every fold of fabric, every crack in skin. The sun felt like it pressed against your skull until you forgot what shade looked like. Most days passed in routine. Patrol, debrief, eat something half-warm from a pouch. It was almost easy to forget where you were until it wasn't. Lauren died on a Tuesday. There was no warning. One step too far off the road. 1 second of silence is too deep. The blast was sharp, but what stayed with me was the stillness after. No gunfire, no screams. Just ringing in my ears and the sound of dirt raining down. I was 5 steps behind her. 5 steps that should have been nothing. I saw her hand, not moving, and her boots, half covered in debris. My body moved before my mind caught up. But there was nothing to save. They called it a clean hit. Instant. I hated that word. Like it was something surgical. Like the person I ran with, laughed with, slept next to in bunkers, was just a name on a clipboard now. The nights after that were long and loud in my head. I'd hear her voice sometimes, in the buzz of the generator or the creak of the cot. I'd look up, expecting to see her roll her eyes or toss me a granola bar. I stopped writing home, stopped checking my reflection. I didn't care if the higher-ups knew my name. Recognition didn't mean anything if Lauren wasn't here to laugh about it. I started running longer in the mornings, past where the patrols ended. I carried more gear than I needed. I volunteered for the assignments no one wanted. If there was risk, I wanted it. Not because I wanted to die, but because part of me already had. That was when the war changed for me. It stopped being about proving anything. I wasn't climbing ranks anymore. I was standing in for people who didn't get to. Every salute, every medal, every mile on the sand felt like it belonged to someone else. I carried it all like a weight on my back. Not out of guilt, but because I had to. I didn't become stronger after Lauren died. I became quieter. Still. And in that stillness, I found something like purpose. It didn't bring peace, but it gave me a reason to keep going. The invitation arrived, folded in thick cream paper, with a gold seal pressed into the corner. It was from a veterans nonprofit hosting a fundraising gala in Washington, D.C., honoring active and retired military women. My name was listed on the program beneath a short paragraph, Major General Jessica Blake, decorated for service in Afghanistan. I didn't want to go. Not because of the crowd or the speeches, but because I didn't know if he'd be there. My father's name was everywhere in that world. Donor plaques, endowments, golf tournaments. If it involved money and prestige, he found a way to be in the middle of it. I sat with the invitation for 2 weeks before saying yes. Something in me wanted to stand there in uniform and not flinch. Not for revenge, not for closure. Just to prove that I belonged in the room, whether he showed up or not. The night of the gala was cold and clear. I wore my dress blues, pressed and exact. The medals were polished, the shoes silent. As I walked into the hotel, my reflection caught in the revolving glass door. I barely recognized myself. The ballroom glowed with warm light, chandeliers dangling like frost. Music played softly through the speakers. Laughter rose in short bursts. I hovered outside for a breath, waiting for the nerves to settle. Then I heard it. His voice. Off to the left, surrounded by 3 men in tuxedos. He was laughing, the kind of laugh he used when he was telling a story meant to impress. Then I caught the line. At least the army pays her rent. The sentence hit me like a slap I saw coming but couldn't dodge. It was a joke. But it was the same kind of joke he'd made my whole life. The kind that took something real and chipped at it until it felt like nothing. I stepped forward. The aide at the door cleared his throat and announced my name. The music faded. Forks paused midair. People turned. One by one, heads pivoted toward the doorway where I stood straight-backed, ribbons shining across my chest. My father looked up last. His glass hovered near his mouth. His smile slipped just slightly, like his brain hadn't caught up with what his eyes were seeing. His hand lowered. His jaw tightened. I walked slowly. Every step measured, heels quiet against the marble. Eyes followed me, but I only watched one person. Not him. Her. My mother stood near the edge of the room, in a soft gray dress. Her shoulders pulled back like she was holding herself together by will alone. She looked older than I remembered. Smaller, but still strong. When I reached her, I stopped, lifted my hand, and saluted. She didn't move at first. Then her mouth trembled into something close to a smile. She reached up, not to return the salute, but to gently press her palm to my cheek. The room exhaled around us. I never looked back at him. I didn't need to. That moment wasn't his to own. It was mine. It was hers. It was for every time we had to swallow silence at dinner, every time she tucked away her own pain to protect me. I didn't attend the gala to confront him. I went to stand in my own space, to reclaim something I hadn't even realized I'd lost. And when I walked past him, without a glance, I knew he felt it too. The weight of being seen, the weight of being irrelevant. I stayed through the speeches, shook hands, and smiled for photos. But that one moment near the door was the only one I needed. It said everything words couldn't, and it echoed louder than anything he had ever said. After the gala, things didn't magically change. My father didn't call. There was no letter, no sudden apology tucked inside a card. But a few months later, my mother told me he had started volunteering at a local VA clinic near Alexandria. At first, I thought it was about image, a new foundation maybe, or another plaque with his name. But when I visited unannounced, he was in the back lot, organizing wheelchairs and helping unload supplies from a van. His suit was gone. He wore khakis and an old sweater, and for the first time, he looked smaller than I remembered. He didn't act surprised to see me. Just nodded and said something about the winter being colder than usual. We didn't talk about the gala. We didn't talk about anything big. He asked if the uniform still fit. I said it did. That was the entire conversation. He started sending me clippings from the paper, articles about women in leadership, notes in the margins that read impressive, or didn't know she was Army. I never knew if he was trying or if he just didn't know how not to try. Either way, I kept every one of them. We had coffee once every few months. Mostly silence, with the occasional memory or comment about my mother's cooking. I never got the words I thought I needed. No direct apology, no moment of reckoning, but something had shifted. He came to one of my promotion ceremonies and stood quietly at the back. Afterward, he shook my hand and held it half a second longer than necessary. His eyes were glassy, but he didn't say much. He didn't need to. Years later, when he passed, I flew in from a training base in Colorado. I didn't cry at the funeral. I sat with my mother and watched as strangers spoke about a man I knew in pieces, a man I spent a lifetime both avoiding and becoming. After the service, I stayed behind while the others left. I walked over to the grave, boots sinking slightly into the soft earth, the sky gray and still. The wind moved through the trees like someone breathing quietly nearby. I didn't bring flowers. I didn't kneel. I just stood there, my uniform perfectly pressed, my hands at my sides, and whispered the only thing I had left to say. You were wrong about me, but I still became someone you'd be proud of.